I noticed that for months Trump was calling it the coronavirus, including in those tweets of praise to Xi Jinping. I think he's saying Chinese virus as a specific rebuke. That's my sense of it. I mean, I know it irritates some people, and I can understand if someone is Chinese American. You know, the word Chinese refers to not just the country and the language, but it also refers to the ethnicity. I can imagine it doesn't feel great. But in my mind, it's just Trump slapping back in his own bully pulpit. Is that how you take it too?
That's how I take it as well. It's not only President Trump, it's also Vice President Pence, Secretary of State Pompeo, using various formulations of either Wuhan virus or Chinese virus. I'm Chinese American. I'm sensitive to these things. I'm not offended at all. On the contrary, I am really pleased that President Trump is defending my country against this very explosive and inflammatory campaign by Beijing. And we Americans, whether we're Chinese Americans or not, have got to understand that Beijing means us harm. We have a common enemy. We've got one president. He's defending us. It's important for us to get in line and support his efforts.
Wow, that's very powerful. I know you're in great demand, so I'm going to set you free quickly. You're doing so many interviews, and I love the fact that we have had a window into your thinking for really years, and now you're everywhere I look. I saw you very briefly at the CPAC convention in Washington. I see you on media everywhere. I'm thrilled that your advice is being widely sought, and I feel like you're sort of our guy because we've been talking to you for so long. Let me ask you one last question. And again, I learned this from your Twitter feed, which I can't recommend highly enough. You've been talking about a long-term change, not just solving the problem, but decoupling the U.S. economy and supply chain from China. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by that?
Well, the United States is, as people have always said, was highly interdependent with China, especially with commerce and investment. We have seen the downsides of that, though, because Beijing, for instance, and this is Xinhua News Agency, beginning of this month, official media outlet, has been threatening to cut off the supply of pharmaceuticals and medical protective gear and to throw the U.S. into what it called, quote unquote, a mighty sea of coronavirus. So we have to understand that we should not allow ourselves to become so highly dependent on a country and a regime like China's. As people said, America buys is dependent on 80 to 97% of its antibiotics from China. We see similarly high percentages in other areas. For instance, we go back to 2008, where China sold the U.S. adulterated heparin. Heparin killed dozens, actually sickened hundreds of Americans. So we've got to understand that in this new era, we have got to start making our own goods that are critical. And this is the reason why the USMCA, the successor to NAFTA, is so important. We need to bring manufacturing back to this side of the Pacific.
Yeah, very interesting. You just made me think about OPEC. A few years ago, America was dependent on dictatorships and regimes that mean harm to America for oil. Now America is self-sufficient, and that's not just good economically, it's good strategically. I think that maybe the same thing could happen with those other critical strategic goods. Not only to make America independent, but it could be an economic boom the same way as domestic oil production is too. I'm going to start thinking about it the same way. Ethical production in America versus risky conflict production in China. You've helped me clarify that, Gordon. I know you've got to run. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. And one last shout out for folks who are not yet following Gordon G. Chang on Twitter. You're doing it wrong. You will learn more from him in one tweet than you will from an entire article in a mainstream media newspaper. That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.